Hi, my name is Father Scott. This is Father Vince. We're two of the apostles of the interior life, and for several years now we've been helping young people to discern their vocations, and along the way we've come up, through spiritual direction and leading a group we have called Samuel Group, coming up with different principles, strategies that we'd like to share with you through these videos that we're going to be offering.
One of the things we'd like to do just before we go ahead and start laying out the vocational discernment process is just to take a step back and look at the vocational discernment process kind of from the bird's eye view, to get a bigger picture and to be able to focus on the essence of what is vocational discernment really. And so I did this little diagram, and we have the mountain, classic image of the spiritual life, and at the top of the mountain we have God. So God is the goal, and He's the goal of everyone's life. The goal of everyone's life is to become a holy, become a saint, which in its essence means to be united with God. And there are paths, and when we talk about vocational discernment, we're talking about two basic states of life. The first, I use blue to delineate the consecrated life, the consecrated state, and the red is to delineate the married state, so the two states that the tradition of the church gives us as the two paths, main paths leading towards God. Why these two? Well, the state of life, again, according to the tradition of the church, has what we call a nuptial character to it. That is, it is a gift of the entire self, the entire person, including also the body. So you might even ask, the difference between the state is who I give my body to. In the married state, of course, doesn't only belong to us as Christians, it belongs to the natural realm, is when I give my body to another person permanently in a marital bond. The consecrated life is the reserving of my body, the consecrating of my body for God alone. And that's something that we find in Christianity. Now I drew the blue line, the consecrated state, as a straight line, straight up from the bottom, straight to God. The married life is a little more winding. And the reason I did that is because the tradition of the church has always held that the consecrated state is the more perfect state. Now, I want to explain that because there could be some ambiguity. We don't mean that consecrated people are better than married people. And it doesn't necessarily mean that consecrated people are more holy than married people. So we're talking not about the person, but we're talking about the state itself. And just to demonstrate this, I want to read a quick passage from the Council of Trent, session 24, which is on the sacrament of marriage. If anyone says that the married state is to be placed above the state of virginity or celibacy, and that it is not better and more blessed to remain in virginity or celibacy than to be united in matrimony, let him be anathema. Now, obviously these are very strong words, and of course the church is not saying, again, that consecrated people are better than married people, but it's the state. Why is the state so important? Why is this so important to understand for vocational discernment? Well, I'd like to read a quick passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 23 to 30. That same day, some Sadducees, who hold there is no resurrection, came to Jesus with the question, "Teacher, Moses declared, if a man dies without children, his brother must take the wife and produce offspring for his brother. Once there were 7 brothers. The eldest died after marrying, and since he had no children, left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second, the third, and so on, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died too. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since all 7 of them married her?" Jesus replied, "You are badly misled, because you fail to understand the Scriptures and the power of God. When people rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but live like the angels in heaven." So Jesus affirms that in the eternal life, that is, in the resurrection, marriage will no longer be necessary. Why? Not because marriage is bad, just the opposite, because marriage is a sign of the eternal union, the eternal nuptial union that we are called to have with God. And so, marriage, as the sign, will no longer be necessary when the reality is present. So, again, not that the consecrated person is better than the married person, but the state itself is an anticipation, it's an already living upon this earth of the eternal life in heaven. And that's why it's the greater state. So this is just something that's really important to keep in mind in the vocational discernment process, and I hope that as we go forward, it'll become clear why it's so important to understand these two states and to understand what they are in their essence. Now, we might also ask, why only two? Some people talk about 4 states. Some people talk about what we call the single life, and some people also talk about the priesthood. And that is not totally untrue, of course, but the tradition of the church has always talked about 2 states. And the single life and the priesthood are 2 states that are assimilated to these 2 states. So the single life, a person remains single usually because of some sort of circumstance of life, whether it be because they're not able to enter into marriage because of perhaps a physical defect, or perhaps they never meet the right person. But the important thing is that the single life is not a state of life in and of itself because it does not have a nuptial character to it. So when a person is not able to marry, that state, living in a single manner, assimilates itself to marriage, because if the person were able, then he would marry. The same is true with the priesthood, because at least in the West, the church asks all priests to be celibate. The priesthood assimilates itself to the consecrated life. And so the nuptial character of the priest is lived out in a consecrated way, in a celibate way. These are just some really important principles to understand before we go further.
Yeah, so what Father Vince has been focusing on is the core of vocational discernment, which is, which of these 2 states am I called to? Am I called the consecrated life, or am I called to the married state? And at the same time, though, there is, in the discernment process, if you expand it out a little bit from there, you see that there's a little bit more to it than that. We've got a lot of things that come before that, and there's even some that comes after figuring out what state of life we're called to. So before we get to that question of, am I called to consecrated life, or am I called to marriage, there's a whole realm that we can call pre-discernment, which is getting to that mountain. You know, if you think about climbing a mountain, you don't just show up at the mountain one day and start to climb. You know, you got to get ready, you got to get in shape, you got to get your boots and your gear and your backpack and maybe a guide and a map. There's a lot of stuff if you want to make it to the top of that mountain that you need to have. So that pre-discernment phase is getting all of that together that you need. And there's just a few very basic things that we need to put together. We got to have a solid prayer life. Ideally, have a spiritual director. Begin to grow in virtue. Get rid of distractions. Overcome some major sins or attachments that might be holding us back. Heal some wounds that we've been carrying around. And all of that just is a way of laying the foundation, really becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ, getting to that point where we can say, whatever you want, God. You want me married? Awesome. You want me consecrated? That's great. I'm either one, I'm okay. When we get to that point of interior freedom, then this discernment phase, this general discernment phase of the 2 states, am I called the married life or consecrated life, becomes that much easier. So stage 1, pre-discernment. Stage 2, general discernment. Stage 3, then, once you figured out, I'm called to marriage, I'm called to consecrated life, that specific discernment is, okay, I'm called to marriage. Who am I called to marry? And we'll go through the process of figuring out how we can know who we're called to marry and getting ready to welcome that person into our lives. Or, I'm called to consecrated life, okay, or the priesthood. Where am I called to consecrate my life? What community or what diocese is God calling me to be a priest in? So we'll take a look at specific discernment. How can I know specifically where God is calling me to be? Yeah, that's kind of the overview of the big picture. Next video, we're going to take a look at some of the general principles of vocational discernment. Then we'll jump into pre-discernment, move on eventually to general and specific discernment. So.
Stay tuned.